21세기의 금이라고 인식되는 반도체, 인공지능 시대를 맞아 반도체 기술은 단순한 산업을 넘어 국가의 명운을 좌우하는 핵심 전략 자산이 되었습니다. 이미 우크라이나 러시아 전쟁에서는 러시아의 미사일과 드론에서 미국 인텔, 한국 삼성, 대만 TSMC 등의 반도체가 발견된 바 있습니다. 북한도 이런 반도체를 사용한 무기들을 러시아에 보내고 있습니다. 북한은 어떻게 대북 제재의 촘촘한 감시망을 뚫고 제조에 필요한 자원과 부품을 수입하는 걸까요? 북한은 국제사회의 제재망을 우회하여 필요한 반도체를 기초적인 수준이나마 자체적으로 생산하고 해외 반도체 설계도를 해킹하여 기술 획득을 추구합니다. 실제로 평양에 설립된 111호 공장에서는 미약하지만 미사일과 군사장비에 필요한 반도체를 생산하고 있습니다. 심지어 외국에서 생산된 세탁기 같은 가전제품을 해체하여 필요한 반도체를 수집하고 이를 미사일 제작에 활용하기도 합니다. 또한 북한은 국가적 차원에서 양성된 세계 최고 수준의 해커 그룹을 한국을 비롯한 해외의 우수한 반도체 및 연관 첨단 과학 기술 획득에 활용하고 있습니다. 모든 나라처럼 북한도 반도체가 필요합니다. 그렇다면 북한은 반도체 기술을 어떻게 확보하고 있을까요? 미국 한미경제연구소의 톰 라미지 연구원이 우리가 몰랐던 반도체와 IT 기술 현황을 설명드립니다.
Hello, my name is Tom. I am an economic policy analyst with the Korea Economic Institute of America here in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to present today on North Korea's semiconductor industry, their domestic production, as well as how they receive access to semiconductors. I first got interested in this issue, one, from my time in Korea at Yonsei University. I spent a year as an exchange student there, classes on North Korean politics and society. But then later in my career, when the pandemic happened, there was a shortage of semiconductors in the United States, and semiconductors became a huge part of U.S. economic policy as it relates to export controls and limiting foreign entities of concerns access to advanced semiconductors because of their role in things such as war game modeling and quantum computing and artificial intelligence. So I got interested in this subject researching for it with the North Korea Economic Forum at George Washington University. Before I get into this, I just wanted to read some news today that Korea's unification minister nominee Chung Dong-young said during his confirmation hearing that North Korea has 3 semiconductor factories in Pyongyang, Pyeongseong, and Wonsan. So this should actually be some good context as we get into this. So let's begin. The bottom line up front is that yes, North Korea has at least one semiconductor production facility known as the Pyongyang 111 factory, but for the most part, it relies on foreign import partners to receive its semiconductors. Of course, there are different types of semiconductors. There are the memory chips that we see in laptops and smartphones, and then we get to the advanced node chips, which you may find in GPUs for artificial intelligence. The second one poses more risk to national security, but nonetheless, both are part of North Korea's military and technological development. How I went through this? A few things. One, I went through U.S. government intelligence reports, which were declassified, which talked about North Korea's technological development, and that provided some good secondary source material on the subject. 2, if you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., they actually have North Korean journals that you can browse through on site only, for at least at that time. These include North Korea's electronics journals, which contain a lot of information about their research capabilities and their aspirations towards producing semiconductors. So I have a quote here that semiconductor devices, integrated circuits, electronic calculators, and other modern automation elements and means are produced in large numbers and their quality must be improved. This was by Kim Il-sung in 1980. one of many such quotes that is from these academic journals. And moreover, this is a dismantled missile recovered in Ukraine from January 2024. A conflicts armament research investigation found the majority of its electronic components came from the United States. So this tells you a little bit about North Korea's access to electronic components, even when under comprehensive sanctions regime. So why is this important? Once again, if you have semiconductors, of course, you have smartphones and laptops, or perhaps television sets. There are semiconductors in anything from washing machines to cars. But if you have advanced semiconductors, you can do advanced war game modeling, you can do modeling of thermonuclear detonations, and then you could even use it for your hacking efforts and encryption breaking when it gets to quantum computing. Once again, there's a security element to this. But let's start with the history of the North Korean semiconductor industry. A little hard to pinpoint unless we go to North Korea and talk to them ourselves. Of course, North Koreans have said before that their semiconductors come from China for the most part, so that's an easy mystery there. But they still had an academic, at least academic industry for this, even while they were targeted under Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, or COCOM. So an intelligent estimate by the United States found that prior to their mass import of materials to build a huge semiconductor manufacturing base, they had about 10 electronics factories in the country. And then a US intelligence report in 1969 recalled them receiving production equipment from 2 companies in Japan that allowed them to be capable of producing up to 10,000 integrated circuits a week. The 10 plants that I mentioned before this were built using Chinese or Soviet support. And one North Korean electronics journal article I found talked about a 1958 visit by Kim Il-sung to Kimchek University of Technology, touring a semiconductor materials laboratory, which it then stated is now the Semiconductor Integrated Circuit Laboratory. So we know that they're not just talking about semiconductors as a material that conducts electricity. And relevant to the comments by the Unification Minister nominee today, there are also reports of a Haeju semiconductor plant and a Dancheon Yongye Army semiconductor plant, but present status is unknown. Here on the right is actually just a picture I took of one of the North Korean electronic journals. If you read through them, oftentimes they'll give you some good anecdotes on, the attention paid to this industry. Of course, you can see here they're citing the IEEE and other foreign reference points, which gives you some indication as to their level of attention to foreign research. So moving past the 1970s, one semiconductor factory that we know of, Pyongyang 111 Semiconductor Factory, was completed in 1986. This was actually using United Nations Industrial Development Organization support. It started as a prototype facility, and then it transitioned to a full-scale facility in 1989. A map by Andre Abrahamian and Curtis Melvin pins it within the State Academy of Sciences, which is in the Unjong High-Tech Zone, as they point out. And then, of course, we get other visits by the North Korean leaders to different sites, talking about the importance of semiconductors. But even though they had this factory, reporting in the New York Times from their first ballistic missile launch in 1998 showed that about 30 to 40% of the semiconductors in the missile were sourced from Japan. I think this leans a lot into their leveraging of trading companies and overseas communities, as well as perhaps smuggling to access this type of technology. We also see a 2009 press release of Kim Jong-il inspecting the Hamhung Semiconductor Materials Factory. And Hamhung is the site of the Hamhung Computer College, where it is known to be a grooming area for North Korea's notorious hackers. So this is a potential site relating to their electronics industry. Of course, a caveat to this, semiconductor materials factory That doesn't tell us a lot, again, because the word semiconductor can mean any material that disperses electricity. But the presence of the computer college gives us some clues. So beyond the factories, now the factory itself, U.S. intelligence estimates show that it had low yield rates, and it operated in the micron width scale as opposed to the nanometer width scale. There is a lot of academic research going on at Kim Il-sung University, Kim Chek University of Technology, and Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. So these universities all appear to have semiconductor departments for research. And then Unit 121, this hacking group, is actually known to have a supercomputer made using imported computers. And in China's case, their own supercomputer is reportedly made using American CPUs. So that gives us some indication as to how the Unit 121 supercomputer might be operating. Now, how did they get semiconductors where they don't produce them themselves? Well, North Korean diplomats posted abroad are likely capable of using a diplomatic pouch to smuggle. North Korean trading companies as well, historically, which may have been posted in other countries. Central Party Bureau number 9 is in charge of importing computer equipment, and the National Defense Academy is active in acquiring technology from abroad. Overseas North Korean communities in countries like Japan were often targeted as willing collaborators. But presently, when it comes to smartphones or laptops, China is the likely source, and there have been some break-apart examinations of the North Korean smartphone that just show it uses Toshiba and Taiwanese hardware, likely smuggled through third-party countries. Now, North Korea's high concentration of rare earth elements also gives it an edge when it wants to make official deals to access semiconductors. For example, I think one recent deal showed that North Korea offered rare earth elements in return for access to technology, including semiconductors. And smuggling doesn't appear to be as difficult as smuggling manufacturing equipment. We all heard about the DeepSeek upset in China. That was reportedly created using imported NVIDIA chips that came on flights going into the country from elsewhere. Again, on March 10th, 2025, a North Korean smartphone producer made an agreement with a Chinese technology company to acquire semiconductors in a rare earths for technology deal out in Sunueju. And troublingly, on March 4th, 2024, South Korea's National Intelligence Service issued a letter warning that from at least 2023 onwards, North Korea has been increasing hacking efforts targeting South Korean companies in order to steal designs. Now, that raises an interesting question. Is North Korea using those designs for their own factory? Or are they selling off those designs as a way to get some illicit money? And then last on that point, when Vladimir Putin began to increase his collaboration with North Korea at the Vostochny Cosmodrome, where North Korea is now very present in the Ukraine conflict, Putin offered technological assistance in return for his exchange with Kim Jong-un. That is the gist of my presentation. If you'd like to learn more, I wrote a paper about this for George Washington University North Korea Economic Forum, and here are some of my selected references.
Great. Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty impressive presentation one more time. And it's pretty interesting for you to research on the semiconductor industry, say, improve this manufacturing capacity of semiconductor industry in the near future, or just try to find a way to acquire the semiconductors, from other countries, including China, South Korea, the United States, and of course, Taiwan. Now, you made a presentation on their level of the North Korea semiconductor industry. Of course, it's even nano level, it's more micron level. That's the nano level, semiconductors is indispensable for especially in the military use. What's your take on this issue?
Yeah, so of course we've all heard about North Korea's Juche self-reliance ideology. Now I'm not an expert on to what extent they are still following that, but to maintain military modernization or economic modernization in the long run, I would imagine that they would probably want to develop some form of self-reliant access to semiconductors. And judging by the faculties at their research universities, they seem to be capable of it at least, and at least make domestic progress toward research in that area. And they're certainly interested. But on a day-to-day basis at the citizen level, I think they are reliant on using imported semiconductors, especially for things like electronics. Now, it's troubling the fact that Unit 121 appears to have a supercomputer, and given North Korea's hacking efforts abroad, what they may be using that for, as well as what type of semiconductors they want to use to power it, and their ability to perhaps collaborate with other countries to do that on their own, will be something to keep an eye on. But the fact is, the United States had a semiconductor shortage during the pandemic. So therefore, in North Korea's case, it would be very difficult to not also have that type of dearth of supply.
I agree. And recently, the Ukraine government demonstrates that Russian missiles and drones use semiconductors, as you just said, made in the United States, made in the South Korea, made in Taiwan, of course, made in China. How do we compare the Russian and the North Korean cases, which are non-semiconductor manufacturers, in the semiconductor acquiring strategy from the various point of view?
Well, one, I think it would indicate that North Korea, or Russia in this case, gives military prioritization when it comes to access to technologies. In North Korea's case, to the extent that they may have a shortage of semiconductors, this would make me believe that they would be directing any semiconductors they have, or the types that they need, first to the military and then downstream from there.
So, and you mentioned about the North Korea's the large volume of rare earth material in this dynamics of semiconductor politics. How does North Korea use this rare earth material as a leverage, to acquire for the chips? This is a pretty interesting, argument. So, can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so we just saw a deal announced where North Korea used rare earth elements as a means to access semiconductors. So it's definitely a major leverage. I think, if I'm not incorrect, North Korea has one of the largest reserves of rare earth elements in the world, which would be of extreme interest to technology companies who do business with North Korea, whether that would be in Russia or China. It'd be interesting to follow that a little bit more. But on top of that, North Korean gold and other elements have been found in global supply chains, where often they'll go to a Chinese smelter, but the origin, even in US electronics, I think it's been found that some of the gold has originally come from North Korea. So whether we know it or not, a lot of these elements do end up in our supply chains.
So then those rare earth materials, of course, gold, it's the leverage, the target of leverage to acquire a semiconductor is probably not the United States, South Korea, Taiwan. It might be China, right? China is going to play a role of a middleman, to import and export, to the semiconductors into North Korea for sure. Right?
Yes, and that is something I found in my research. Of course, there were a lot of instances of collaboration with Chinese telecommunications companies across the border. And of course, entrepôts like Macau often serve as an illicit financing hub. Also, the North Korean links with criminal groups such as the Triads. North Korea will also do ship-to-ship transfers to smuggle in things such as oil or others. And then North Korea is also a pretty big exporter of sand, dredged sand out of the Haeju Bay. So they're maintained in this trade. And again, we know that a lot of these semiconductors come through China as a middleman.
We know that Singapore and Malaysia, the two countries to connect these semiconductor manufacturers, and the importers in Russia and other countries too. So it's pretty interesting for us to take a look at the relationship between among China, Singapore, and then Malaysia, and then say Russia and then North Korea too. Probably Iran later on.
And in fact, we now have this order, some people are calling it the CRINC of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And to the extent that at least Russia and Iran are involved in conflicts, and then China and North Korea have their own relations with either of those countries, we may see more collaboration, at least between North Korea and Russia, into the future. And that would raise questions about North Korea's technological modernization and access to these technologies.
So basically, the United States export control of this strategic asset, such as semiconductors, and sanctions, UN sanctions, and then bilateral sanction and the multilateral sanction are not functioning, for preventing North Korea from accessing this strategic asset of semiconductors.
I think they're doing that the best that they can. I think we'll never really know how much more advanced they would be without these types of sanctions in place. But it's difficult because semiconductors are so small. They can be easily smuggled, and so what would be more concerning is access to advanced lithography equipment, which you wouldn't really be able to smuggle since lithography equipment is the size of a shipping container. So I think the US government will probably continue down this path of small yard, high fence, of restricting access to these advanced technologies, especially as it relates to artificial intelligence and quantum computing.
이번 논의가 보여주는 것은 명확합니다. 북한은 세계적인 수준의 IT 인력을 무기 삼아 해킹으로 첨단 기술을 훔치고 이를 자체 개발에 적용하거나 무방국인 중국, 러시아에 판매할 수 있는 수준에 이르렀습니다. 이는 무엇을 의미할까요? 우리가 북한을 묘사할 때 흔히 사용하는 고립된 은둔의 왕국이라는 말은 어쩌면 가장 위험한 착각일지도 모릅니다. 북한은 결코 고립되어 있지 않습니다. 불법적인 방식일지언정 중국, 러시아, 그리고 제3국을 통해 첨단 산업에 필요한 자원을 꾸준히 확보하는 교역 네트워크를 유지하고 있기 때문입니다. 지난 시즌1에 저스틴 헤이스팅스 교수가 밝혔듯이 북한의 물류망은 싱가포르와 말레이시아 같은 제3국을 통해 복잡하게 조성되어 있습니다. 이제는 러시아가 거기에 확실히 더해졌죠. 해외의 북한 외교관, 개발자 해커, 다른 외화벌이 일꾼들은 단순히 외교 업무만을 수행하는 것이 아닌 이 네트워크의 핵심 연결고리 역할을 하고 있는 것입니다. 따라서 이제 우리는 북한을 바라보는 시각을 바꿔야 합니다. 고립된 저개발 국가라는 낡은 프레임에서 벗어나 주어진 국제 제재 환경 속에서 그들이 어떤 방법으로 생존하고 첨단 기술을 발전시키며 체제를 유지하는지 냉철하게 직시해야 할 때입니다. 북한의 진짜 모습은 바로 그 안에 있기 때문입니다.